On April 20, 2026, the freezing stillness over the Baltic Sea was suddenly torn apart, without warning shots, without visible escalation. Deep inside NATO's integrated air surveillance network, a monitoring node embedded on Sweden's island of Gotland registered an anomaly that immediately sent shockwaves through command centers stretching from Warsaw to Washington. Within less than a minute, the system identified 12 high-speed inbound contacts emerging from a Kaliningrad military exclusion zone. They were moving northwest at nearly 900 kilometers per hour, appearing with unnerving precision, as if they had been placed rather than detected. There was something worse than their speed. They were not attempting stealth. They were not hiding at all. In modern air defense logic, that alone was a warning sign of intent, confidence, aggression, and coordination. At the Combined Air Operations Center in Ramstein, Germany, the duty watch officer stared at the tactical data link display in disbelief as automated classification systems rapidly resolved the formation. The first identification was immediate and chilling. 22M3 Backfire C, supersonic strategic bombers, nuclear-capable platforms designed for long-range maritime strike missions. Their role was unmistakable: penetrate NATO's maritime defense perimeter, deploy Kh-32 anti-ship missiles, and demonstrate Russia's ability to threaten carrier groups at extreme range. But they were not alone. Flanking them in a disciplined combat formation were 10 Su-30SM and Su-35S multi-role fighters. Their advanced passive electronically scanned array radars were already sweeping the airspace ahead, painting a digital map of everything in range. This was not a training exercise. It was not routine patrol behavior. This was a spearhead formation, and it was heading directly toward NATO's eastern flank. What Russian planners did not anticipate, however, was how quickly the situation would evolve once the alert chain activated. Within seconds, NATO's rapid response architecture engaged across 6 nations simultaneously: France, Sweden, Finland, Poland, Denmark, and Romania. It became the largest coordinated airborne intercept response in Europe since the Cold War. This was not improvisation. It was not reactionary chaos. It was a pre-engineered contingency system, years of planning now executing at machine speed. And beneath the surface of the Baltic Sea, another piece had already been moved. A piece Moscow believed no one had noticed. But the air formation was only the visible layer of something far more complex. To understand the danger of this moment, one must understand the broader geopolitical conditions that shaped it. In the 72 hours leading up to the intercept, Russia had been operating under intense pressure. Ukrainian drone forces had escalated their campaign against Russian logistics networks, command infrastructure, and ammunition depots. Thousands of drone sorties per day were systematically degrading Russia's ability to sustain its spring offensive. The Kremlin needed relief. Not necessarily military victory, but strategic distraction. A shift in NATO attention. And in the West, distraction was already in abundance. 3 American carrier strike groups were deployed in the Middle East under Operation Epic Fury against Iran. It was the largest U.S. naval concentration in the region in over 2 decades. Intelligence agencies from Langley to European command centers were focused almost entirely on the Strait of Hormuz, anticipating escalation against Iranian energy infrastructure. This created a rare strategic imbalance. NATO's attention was divided. Washington was stretched, and Moscow saw opportunity. The 22M3 bombers were not intended to penetrate NATO airspace. That was never the objective. Their role was psychological and operational noise, forcing NATO to respond, redirecting surveillance assets, and masking something far more dangerous. At 3:22 hours, forward NATO air policing units stationed in Lithuania received immediate scramble orders. French Rafale F-4 fighters launched within minutes, accelerating into the cold Baltic air with full afterburner thrust, climbing rapidly into intercept altitude. At the same time, Swedish S-39E Gripens launched from Ronneby Air Base, while Finnish F/A-18 Hornets pushed into the same corridor. Polish F-16s and Danish fighters converged into a unified intercept grid that would have been impossible just years earlier, before NATO expansion in the Nordic region fundamentally reshaped the alliance's northern air defense geometry. By 3:31 hours, NATO fighters made first radar visual contact. The 22M3s were cruising at over 10,000 meters altitude, their variable sweep wings adjusted for long-range efficiency. Under their wings were fully armed Kh-32 missiles, supersonic, long-range, and designed to defeat naval air defenses with terminal speeds exceeding Mach 4. These were not inert training systems. These were live weapons. At this moment, NATO's airborne early warning system, an E-3A Sentry orbiting over Poland, began detecting something unusual. The duty controller later described it as anomalous contact clustering, a phrase that understated the reality. The radar picture was breaking apart, and the cause was Russian electronic warfare systems. The jamming pods aboard the bombers activated, not to blind NATO fighters directly, but to saturate the medium-frequency radar spectrum with false returns. The sky filled with ghost contacts. Dozens became hundreds. The tactical display became a shifting storm of synthetic targets. If you are a commander looking at 12 real aircraft and suddenly see 200 returns, how do you decide which is real? That uncertainty is the weapon. At 3:38 hours, a Danish P-8A Poseidon conducting maritime surveillance near the Swedish economic zone detected something even more critical. Its sensors identified an object beneath the Baltic Sea, near the exact corridor of Europe's most important underwater infrastructure. Fiber optic cables connecting financial systems, government networks, and military communications. The contact was large, approximately 180 meters, slow-moving, deep, a Kilo-class submarine, and it was not alone in intent. While NATO's attention was locked in the sky, Russia's true objective was beneath the surface. The aerial formation, the bombers, the fighters, the electronic warfare saturation, was a diversion, a carefully constructed shield of noise designed to mask underwater movement. Because beneath the Baltic, the submarine was advancing toward one of Europe's most critical infrastructure nodes. If those cables were severed, Baltic states could be isolated digitally within hours. NATO command coordination would degrade. Financial systems would destabilize. Communication networks would fracture. This was the real battlefield, not the sky, but the seabed. At 3:41 hours, the Poseidon transmitted a high-priority encrypted alert directly to NATO Maritime Command in Northwood, UK. The message triggered immediate subsurface response protocols. Allied submarines already operating in the region, running near silent, under strict emission control, received activation orders. The hunters were now active. At the same time, tension in the airspace escalated dangerously. A Su-35 escort broke formation. Its vector shifted directly toward a French Rafale at closing speed exceeding 1,400 kilometers per hour. For a moment, the engagement geometry collapsed into pure instinct and reaction. The Rafale pilot deployed countermeasures, executed a high-G brake, and entered a defensive posture that signaled one thing clearly: refusal to yield. Within seconds, the Rafale's radar locked onto the Russian fighter. Not a scan, a fire control lock. That moment changed everything. The Su-35 did not fire, but for 4 seconds, neither aircraft moved away. 4 seconds is nothing in time, but everything in combat physics. Then the Russian fighter broke off and returned to formation. A near-catastrophic escalation was avoided by seconds of restraint. At 3:47 hours, NATO's airborne commander issued a new directive. Instead of maintaining parallel tracking, NATO fighters executed a coordinated split encirclement maneuver, isolating the bomber formation from its escort fighters. The message was clear: control the escorts, control the formation. The Tu-22M3S began a gradual withdrawal posture. But beneath the Baltic Sea, the real operation was still unfolding. At 3:52 hours, the underwater situation reached its most critical phase. A Swedish A-26 Gotland-class submarine, operating in near-total acoustic silence in the complex thermal layers of the southern Baltic, made passive sonar contact with the Russian Kilo-class submarine at a range of approximately 1,800 meters. The Kilo was moving slowly, 2 knots. That speed was not accidental. It indicated preparation for deployment. For what lay beneath the surface was not simply movement, it was intent. External mechanical activity, subtle shifts in propulsion noise, and the faint acoustic signature of cargo bay adjustments all pointed toward a single objective: approach and engage underwater infrastructure. The submarine was moving toward Europe's most vulnerable digital artery. The Baltic Sea floor carried more than water and sediment. It carried fiber optic cables that linked Sweden, Finland, Poland, Germany, and the Baltic states to the global digital network. Financial transactions, military communications, civilian internet infrastructure, all of it passed silently beneath the sea. If those cables were cut, the consequences would unfold faster than any missile strike. Entire regions would lose connectivity. Military coordination would degrade. Economic systems would fracture into isolated pockets, and attribution would be nearly impossible. It would look like an accident, a geological shift, a natural disruption. This was the logic behind the operation. But NATO had anticipated this kind of ambiguity warfare. The Swedish submarine did not engage immediately. Instead, it transmitted encrypted passive sonar data to NATO Maritime Command while maintaining stealth position. The P-8A Poseidon aircraft overhead functioned as a central node, fusing acoustic data from multiple platforms into a unified underwater tracking picture. What emerged was clarity. The Kilo-class submarine was no longer hidden. It was mapped. And more importantly, it was predictable. At 3:55 hours, NATO activated a layered underwater response strategy. Another Allied submarine, operating under strict emissions control in a deeper thermal layer, repositioned silently to create a passive acoustic containment zone around the Kilo's projected movement corridor. It was not an attack posture. It was containment, a net beneath the sea. Above water, the air situation was stabilizing, but only superficially. The Russian bomber formation had begun a controlled withdrawal. The Su-35 escorts rejoined tight formation spacing, maintaining electronic silence as they retreated toward Kaliningrad airspace. But the moment tension began to ease in the sky, pressure increased underwater. At 3:58 hours, NATO Maritime Command authorized a demonstration maneuver. Not engagement, demonstration. The Swedish A-26 submarine moved silently to within 800 meters of the Kilo's port quarter. It activated a short, controlled active sonar pulse through its towed array system. The pulse was sharp, clean, intentional. A single acoustic signature designed not to destroy, but to inform. Inside the Kilo-class submarine, the effect was immediate. The sonar ping echoed through the hull like a physical, an undeniable signal that the vessel had been detected. Not guessed, not tracked loosely, fully localized. Every officer aboard understood the meaning instantly. They were no longer invisible. They were not hunting. They were being hunted. And worse, they did not know by whom. The source of the ping vanished, just as quickly as it appeared. No return signal. No positional confirmation. Just silence after revelation. That silence was more threatening than any weapon, because it implied control. The Kilo's commanding officer faced a rapidly narrowing set of options. Continue toward the cable corridor and risk full interception, or abort and retreat while still undetected by higher command structures. At 4:03 hours, the decision was made. The submarine broke off. It reversed course toward deeper waters and Russian territorial seas, increasing speed to 12 knots. The sudden cavitation spike from its propulsion system was immediately captured by NATO's passive acoustic network. That sound, distinct, identifiable, irreversible, became a permanent entry in NATO's underwater intelligence database. The submarine had revealed itself, not physically, but acoustically. From this moment forward, it could never fully disappear again. It was no longer a black hole asset. It was cataloged. At 4:06 hours, the air domain reached final resolution. The two 22M3 bombers crossed back over international boundaries and entered controlled withdrawal trajectories toward Kaliningrad. The Su-35 escorts maintained formation discipline, still refraining from communication, still operating under strict emission silence. NATO fighters maintained intercept posture until confirmation of full withdrawal. No weapons had been fired, no missiles launched, no explosions occurred, but the outcome was absolute. Russia's multi-domain operation had been dismantled in real time across air, sea, and electronic warfare layers. And more importantly, it had been understood. At 4:14 hours, the final Russian aircraft disappeared from NATO radar coverage. The Baltic sky returned to a controlled calm, but not peace in any meaningful sense. It was the silence after a system stress test, a pause in which every participant understood what had just been proven, that NATO could respond, and respond fast, but also that the system itself had been fully exposed to analysis, because this operation had never been only about movement. It had been about measurement, measuring response time, measuring coordination, measuring hesitation, measuring gaps. And Russia had gathered data even in operational failure. Within 72 hours, global political reactions began to surface. The Polish Prime Minister publicly warned that Russia was capable of launching an attack on NATO territory within months rather than years. His statement was not rhetorical. It was based on classified after-action assessments of the intercept. Western analysts understood the deeper implication. April 20th was not a battle. It was a probe. A full-spectrum diagnostic test of NATO's defense architecture. How quickly would radar systems correlate multiple threats? How fast would command authority propagate across 6 nations? How long would it take to distinguish real targets from electronic deception? And most importantly, how close could Russia push before NATO reacted at maximum speed? The answer had been delivered instantly. No delay. No hesitation. But the test revealed something else as well. The system worked, but only under ideal coordination conditions. And ideal conditions do not exist in prolonged conflict. The real danger was not what happened on April 20th. It was what came after. Because every piece of intelligence collected during that operation, every reaction time, every radar threshold, every decision node, was now part of Russian strategic analysis. They had observed NATO's full response architecture. They had mapped its speed, and they had identified its dependencies. Meanwhile, NATO analysts began constructing their own assessment. They concluded that Russia's operation had 3 layers. The first layer was visible, bombers and fighters. The second layer was electronic, jamming, false targets, radar saturation. The third layer, nearly successful, was subsurface infrastructure disruption. And it was that third layer that caused the greatest concern, because underwater systems are slow to defend, difficult to detect, and almost impossible to attribute in real time. If NATO had been even slightly slower, if the P-8A had been delayed, if the Swedish submarine had been positioned incorrectly, if communication between nodes had failed, the outcome would have shifted dramatically. A single severed cable would not just disrupt communication, it would fracture trust. And in modern warfare, trust is infrastructure. As NATO command structures reviewed the engagement, one conclusion became unavoidable. The Baltic Sea had not been secured. It had been temporarily defended. And somewhere within Russian naval doctrine, planners were already reviewing the same data, calculating improvements, reconstructing timing windows, identifying redundancy failures, because in their assessment, April 20th was not a defeat. It was a near success interrupted by detection. And near successes are not discarded. They are refined. As the aftermath stabilized, one final question remained unspoken across every defense briefing room in Europe. If Russia repeats the operation, with more aircraft, more submarines, and better coordination, will NATO still respond within the same critical seconds? Or will the gap finally open? The Baltic Sea remained under NATO surveillance. The cable still ran beneath it, and the silence returned. But now it was different, because silence after detection is never empty.